Welcome. It's Monday, May 11th. I apologize. I had no notifications on Friday. I intended Friday to be another catch-up day, but I failed to notify you via email or the teacher pages. I got caught up in a meeting, and by the time I realized I'd forgotten, it was already too late. So there was nothing on Friday. You're doing just fine there, and we're going to be in Monday here, Monday, May 11th. So we're continuing with the Cold War. We have discussed the position of America. America experiences the Korean and Vietnam War. America experiences a number of things. The Cold War was a time of tension and upheaval. So the Soviets were content to continue detente, knowing they were breaking all the agreements and growing stronger compared to the US. So let's rewind a bit. Under Nixon, there had been the elevation of what's called detente. Basically, the two superpowers eyed each other and acknowledged each other's existence. So it was supposed to be a thawing of the relationship, meaning that they weren't so angry with each other. And so Nixon was willing to give certain things, and he believed that the Soviets were willing to give up certain things just to maintain peaceful relationships, to try to step everyone back from the brink of a nuclear war. It was during this time Nixon did have a pretty major foreign policy breakthrough. He was able to make some friendship with China, which helped further the split between the Chinese and the Soviet Union. However, the detente was a bit of a fraud because while both sides were agreeing to certain things, selling grain, selling oil, the Soviets were openly breaking promises, and the Americans were foolishly acting as if the Soviets weren't. Things were changing, however. The Soviet economy in the mid 70s and beyond was in a period of stagnation. So ever since the mid 60s, Leonid Brezhnev had been the premier of the Soviet Union. He was an old guard. He had no new ideas, continued the process of these 5-year plans. These 5-year plans were not working. They had never worked before. They were still not working. And the Soviets had made such a massive commitment to the military, especially when it came up to a percentage of the spending, that people were discovering that their living standards were falling. In fact, the Soviet people were living with a standard below that of their parents, meaning they had less access to goods, things like a variety of food, variety of vehicles, various things. And it was worse if you were outside of Russia. If you were ethnic Russian, you had an advantage over other parts of the Soviet Union. This was becoming a major issue, something that could not be ignored. The Soviets were devoting so much of their effort into tanks and planes and trains for the military. It meant that there wasn't enough factory space for things like cars, for goods that people would want to buy. And sometimes there was money for the Soviet people in the sense that they could afford goods. There was just no goods available. Reagan used to tell a joke that was, and many of the best jokes have a grain of truth in it. And Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, was the best at telling these jokes. He would tell a joke, and I know I'm going to mess it up slightly, about a Soviet man goes to the car dealership and he puts his money down and he requests a car. He wants a Lada, he wants it in black, he wants manual transmission, and they work out when it's going to be delivered. And the dealer says it can be delivered 2 years from today. And so they agree on a date. Let's just say it's like June 12th, 2022. And the man says, will it be morning or evening? And the dealer is rather shocked. What does it matter? It's 2 years away. And he says, why is that important? And the man says, well, the plumber is coming in the morning. Meaning that in the Soviet Union, it didn't matter if you were buying a car, or a dishwasher, or if you were getting plumbing done. There was a delay on everything. The economy had stagnated and it was affecting the standard of living for people within the Soviet Union, and that was having some consequences. And Brezhnev did not have the creativity or the wisdom to know how to fix this, partly because the system itself is broken. It's communist. Comparisons were done between the output of factories in the United States versus the output of factories in the Soviet Union. In the United States, where people worked for their own pay, where they could be rewarded for their own success, the amount of output was drastically increased. At the very end of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This was another major event. It was just one more attempt to spread communism for the Soviets. They didn't see what the issue was. Now, admittedly, this was a full invasion. It wasn't a proxy war. But the Soviets had been successful in spreading communism in Cuba, in parts of Asia, all over Africa, parts of South America. Afghanistan seemed like one more easy domino to fall. The Americans were still very wary of getting involved in Afghanistan because of the recent Vietnam War. And so containment as a strategy essentially ended. Under President Jimmy Carter, it wasn't about containing communism because Truman had started the Truman Doctrine, which said containment, hold the communist in one place, and eventually it'll collapse under its own weight, although that had been unsuccessful because the communists had spread. Now under Carter, it wasn't even containment, it was just observation. And what was President Carter's reaction to the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan? He declared that the United States would not participate in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. If that doesn't seem like a very bold step, well, you're not alone in thinking so. For whether it was right or wrong, that was Carter's decision, and so that was the extent of the international response to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. And then everything forever changed. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. Ronald Reagan had run for president at times before. Ronald Reagan was, in his youth, he was a movie star. He was never an A-list star. He was always a B-list star on minor movies. And he was well known, although never top end. He had done a radio show. He had done a number of things. He went on to become governor of California, successful governor of California. And Ronald Reagan was what an interesting man. If you ever get a chance to read about Reagan, I encourage you to do so. Nobody was more consistently underestimated in his life than Ronald Reagan. He was mocked as a fool, mocked as a buffoon, mocked as a clown, and yet he was one of the most brilliant men and most successful men. In fact, probably one of the 5 greatest presidents, maybe even 3, and certainly one of the 5 most pivotal presidents, meaning he changed the world. Ronald Reagan was motivated by a couple of deep beliefs, and one of them was that communism was evil because it ground human individuality underneath the boot of the state. He believed that the strength of America was individual freedom. Ronald Reagan took the Declaration of Independence very seriously, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he didn't think that was just a platitude. He thought that was a way that government should govern and that men should live. So when Carter was competing with Reagan, he had a few things going against him. Number one is the economy in America was as bad as it had been since the Great Depression. Number two is he'd given a speech called The Great Malaise, in which, though not really Carter's fault, Carter was probably a good human being, but he was a very poor president, one of the worst, is that Carter seemed to acknowledge the Soviet Union is going to overcome America and we're just going to have to make peace with that. Now, that wasn't his intent. That was what a lot of people took from it. He was also hurt because within his own party was a particularly deceitful and rather disgusting human being named Ted Kennedy, also Edward Kennedy, same person, who had betrayed him in the party and tried gaining the nomination through underhanded means, which is not surprising when you realize that later on, as senator, Ted Kennedy actually reached out to the Soviet Union to try to undermine the presidency of Ronald Reagan and get himself elected, which, if you think that sounds like treason, you would be correct. But we've, in America, have just made peace with that, I guess. But regardless, Carter is hurt by his own party. He's hurt by the pessimism in America, and he's hurt because Ronald Reagan preaches a fundamentally optimistic message. His message was America's best days were still ahead, and we're not just going to contain, we're going to win. He believed in freedom. He believed in the free market. He believed that communism could not match the economic and military and, let's just call it, spiritual might of the United States. He talked about it had been too long since an American president had walked. Let me explain a dream that he had, not in the sense that he slept, but an idea, a desire he had. He wanted to be elected president, and he wanted to meet with the Soviet premier, and he wanted to sit there and listen to the Soviet premier give a list of demands to the U.S. president. And then, after all the demands were made, he wanted to walk up to the Soviet premier and in his face say, "Niet," which is the Russian word for no. He was tired of Americans bowing down to the Soviets. He was tired of Americans negotiating with the Soviets and losing. He wanted to win. And that was probably the best thing about Reagan is Reagan won. He was a winner. He wanted to win, and he believed in his cause, and he was quite the man for it. This is President Reagan. He was very old for the time. He was uniquely old as a man who was elected president, but he had more energy and more intelligence and more verve than almost all who came for him. Reagan aggressively did his best to unshackle the United States economy from burdensome regulations that went back to Woodrow Wilson. If Reagan was going to push the Soviets, he needed to kick the American economy in high gear. And the American economy had been hampered through years of unnecessary regulations that added expense and took away from innovation. And Reagan launched what was called Reaganomics. It was given to him by others. Reaganomics was mocked by everyone during the time. You can bring up old New York Times articles that talk about how dangerous and foolish and unsuccessful it's going to be, which is ironic because they were written in 1982, 83, and 84, and Reaganomics worked like none other. Reaganomics propelled the United States into a 20-year surge of economic might that has really only been seen in a few other times in history. And Reagan also changed. He wasn't going to do observation. He wasn't going to do containment. Reagan started a policy called rollback, meaning the Americans weren't just going to watch the Soviets take over the world. The Americans were going to push back, and the Soviet Union was going to shrink. And there was no more of this observation. America was going to win. It started in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, the Afghan freedom fighters, were overwhelmed by Soviet technology. If anything in particular, it was the Soviet advanced weaponry as seen in helicopters. They had the Mi-24 Hind helicopter, which was just an unbelievably powerful tool of punishment in the hands of capable Soviet fighters. Well, Reagan, through others, through Charlie Wilson and through other, including some Democrats who were participating, started funneling in new surface-to-air missiles, handheld, they were called Stinger missiles, that allowed these Afghanistan fighters to shoot down helicopters until eventually it became deadly to be a Soviet helicopter pilot. It was quite a change. Afghanistan turned into the Soviet Vietnam. The Soviets could not win. They kept losing men and machines. Their sons kept dying. Back home, the Soviet Union, people were struggling with poverty, lack of food, and the growing knowledge that Afghanistan was going badly. The KGB, which was the Soviet secret service, essentially, that kept everyone in line and used terror often, was keeping control, but the task was becoming harder because more and more people were hearing their son was killed in Afghanistan. This is a picture of one of the helicopters that have been shot down. It was a major event for the Afghans to be able to start dealing with these helicopters and punishing the Soviets that were on their soil. In 1983, Reagan took his boldest step forward yet. He announced SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, but it was nicknamed Star Wars. This was a breaking point. So what was Star Wars? Star Wars was an implausible plan. There was not the technology to do it in the 80s. But that's what makes it even more brilliant, in which the United States was going to launch a series of laser-armed satellites that would cover the world, and that every time the Soviet Union launched a missile, the United States would be able to shoot it down while it was still in space. This means that the Americans could drop nuclear missiles on the Soviets, and the Soviets could not do anything in response. Now, let's talk about technology in the 80s. It was not possible to make this. It was well beyond their capability. But the Soviet Union didn't know that. Reagan did. And essentially, the SDI, they spent several billions of dollars working on it, and it gave other useful technologies. But essentially, SDI Star Wars was a very expensive bluff. And it worked. This was the breaking point. It was, I believe, 82, Brezhnev died. And in his place, a former head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, became the Soviet premier. And then he died after 2 years, and then Chernenko took over. And then Chernenko died after 1 year, and then Gorbachev took over. For a while, Reagan was frustrated because he wanted to do something with these Soviet premiers, but they kept dying on him. The Soviet Union was in a deep period of stagnation and instability. The Soviet Union during this period was willing to compromise to get concessions from Reagan. They were terrified by Star Wars. They believed that the Americans could build it. They knew they could not. And so they began negotiating, and these arms limitation talks that the Americans had been engaged in for some years took a much different turn. Reagan was willing to string along and beat them. So essentially what would happen is Reagan would meet with the Soviet premier. The Soviet premier would say, we will eliminate 1,000 of our intermediate range nuclear missiles. We'll eliminate 500 of our land-based portable missiles. if you will stop Star Wars. And by the way, when all this came out, every American politician was screaming at Reagan, take the deal, take the deal. The Democrats in particular, they screamed that Reagan was a fool and an idiot and maybe even a traitor for not taking the deal. And even the Republicans, many of them said Reagan was a fool. But Reagan knew how to play poker, and apparently no one else did. He refused to take the deal, but he would often say this, you do that and then we'll talk. And so starting in the 80s, the Soviets began reducing a lot of their arms. Now, admittedly, it wasn't entirely in a good spirit. They tended to get rid of their oldest equipment that was already fading and needing to be replaced. It was a smart move on their part. But they would remove a bunch of them, and then they would come to Reagan and say, we did it, now you get rid of SDI. And he'd say, I never promised it. How about more? And so they do more. And so this was essentially the idea. The idea was you would have a satellite here, and the satellite could trace things, and it could shoot down various things. It was a simple idea, but a very complex, and even today, it's unlikely we have the technology to fully implement this. Lasers and satellites, there's a lot there. But Reagan did it. He was bluffing his way to victory. Reagan's tremendous increase in spending on the U.S. military, he essentially doubled the defense budget. Which, by the way, at its peak, probably represented about 6 to 7% of the GDP. That's gross domestic product. So at the most, the United States was spending about 6%, 7% of all that we had on the military. But our economy at this point was getting so strong that in order to match, the Soviet Union was spending almost 25% of its budget on their military. We could afford to spend 6 to 7%, a lot better than the Soviets could afford to spend 25%. Their economy was breaking. It was in the process of falling apart. The stagnation was being amplified, and so much more energy was being devoted to modern planes, modern tanks, modern everything, that food couldn't be on the shelves, that housing was being neglected, that transportation was being neglected. In negotiations, Reagan was pressing harder than anyone had ever pressed the Soviets before, and he was gaining ground. Rollback was working. The Soviets were caving in under the pressure of one man, of Ronald Reagan. In the mid-1980s, it became obvious to the Soviet leadership that something had to change. The new premier was a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, which, by the way, who was a good man, who was an intelligent man, who probably did the best he could under the circumstances. And I say good, it's comparatively speaking. But he advocated perestroika, which was a restructuring of social, political, and economic order. The 5-year plans of Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev were not going to continue. They couldn't. The Soviet Union was falling so far behind, so hopelessly out of date, and unable to even provide necessities to its people, that something had to change. This was going to require, if you were going to change things, it was going to demand a new level of openness. And this openness was called glasnost. And by the way, it was during this time that the Chernobyl nuclear accident of 1986 occurred. And this also spurred openness. The Chernobyl accident was largely the result of decades of lies by the Soviet nuclear industry that resulted in a lot of death and a great deal of poison. All these were contributing to what was to come. So Gorbachev's twin strategies of perestroika, which was restructuring, and glasnost, which was openness, these were risky moves. Essentially, they were willing to break communism to save communism, because they were going to allow limited degree of private ownership as an inspiration to growth and to investment. In Eastern Europe, Reagan had tapped into an already powerful desire for freedom. He was doing what he could to supply the Eastern European nations who were under the Iron Curtain with hope, and sometimes even more. This was most clearly seen in Poland. Poland had never forgotten the lesson of World War II, which was that both the Nazis and the Soviets had invaded. A labor union called Solidarity had actively opposed communism. Also from Poland was Pope John Paul II. He was a Polish man, and he fought hard against communism. Now later, in 1989, Lech Walesa, who was one of the leaders of this movement, he became prime minister. But earlier attempts at freedom in Eastern Europe, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, had been crushed by tanks. But Poland kept pushing, and America kept lending just enough support, so it became obvious in the mid-80s that if the Soviet Union was thinking of sending tanks into Poland to reassert authority, the Americans were going to act, which had not happened earlier. And so this meant the Soviets had to back down. Reagan publicly proclaimed American support for Poland. Suddenly, the Soviet Union had further options. They were genuinely worried. For years before Reagan, they knew no American president was really going to go to war. And for good or for ill, and by the way, I think it's good, the Soviets were terrified of Reagan. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was willing to declare war, and it's good when your enemies think you're crazy. They grow fearful of you, and they were fearful of Reagan. Other Eastern nations began to stir now that they saw that there was an American president who was willing to take the idea of leader of the free world seriously. And by the way, during this time, we'll talk more later, the Prime Minister of Great Britain was England's greatest Prime Minister since Winston Churchill, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, and she was side by side a deep believer in freedom for Europe and a brilliant leader in her own right. East Germany was supposed to be one of the most profitable of the Iron Curtain nations. And yet East Germans were still fleeing to West Germany as much as possible. Reagan had basically, through force of his own will, and there is a desire to rewrite history. There are a lot of people who claim that Reagan only played a small role in the ending of the Cold War. Those people are not being honest. Everyone stood against Reagan. Reagan alone, through his own sheer determination, through, as I said, the force of his own will, essentially ended the Cold War. He did not have the support of the Democrats, and he had very little support even among his own party and the Republicans. Yet he pressed ahead because he believed in what he was doing, and he believed he knew what he was doing, and time has proved that he was right on both counts. And so we're seeing, as the Cold War is coming to its end, as the Soviet Union is beginning to fall apart under the weight of President Ronald Reagan of the United States. So we'll continue there in the days ahead.